Good evening, y'all. How you doing? Good to see you. My name is Mike Siegel. I'm the political director of Ground Game Texas, which is a political organization here. And I was asked by Professor Roy Casagrande to provide a lecture tonight on how local organizing is the key to statewide political change. So I appreciate y'all coming out. Basically, the core thesis that I have here is that if you want to change the politics of a state like Texas, you don't start at the top, you start at the bottom. And that even though a lot of our attention in terms of the media and TV and pundits and experts focuses on the big name candidates or the national organizations, that really the long-term path to changing politics is city by city, community by community. And an example is in politics, we recently had a governor's race, right, where the Democratic nominee, Beto O'Rourke, raised over $80 million. And all the attention was on that one person. Or in another context, if you think about environmental issues, you have famous groups like the Sierra Club, or on abortion issues, it's Planned Parenthood. And so much of our attention goes to those organizations. But in reality, the big name groups, the celebrities, the national organizations, they come and go. But if you look at the map of Texas, you look at all the cities and communities across the state, it's really those local groups that are going to fight day in and day out. They're going to activate people and energize people, teach people how to get involved, inspire folks. And that's really a key, if not the most important part for long-term political change. So that's kind of what I'm talking about here. And just a little bit about my background. I'm one of these weird people that really likes politics and is obsessed with politics. I read about politics in my spare time. I was raised in a family, basically my parents met in Berkeley, California in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. When I was in my mom's womb, she was on strike as a union organizer. It was the kind of family where we would talk about politics at the dinner table. So I have to admit that I come at this from a little bit of a strange place. But also, I'm very invested in kind of our future. I was a public school teacher, my first job. I started out in Houston, Texas, taught 3rd grade, 5th grade, and 8th grade, because I believe that children are the future, right? That's how we make long-term change for the better. I later became a civil rights lawyer. I was a city attorney in Austin for a while. I even ran for Congress a couple times in this area. And now I lead an organization along with a compatriot named Julie Oliver, where we're trying to raise money to organize in different cities. And we're doing campaigns in places like El Paso. We're organizing for a change to local law to focus on climate action. We're working in San Antonio, where we're trying to do criminal justice reform. We have a May ballot election where we're trying to decriminalize marijuana, decriminalize abortion, and also accomplish some other police reforms. So I'm coming at this as a person who's invested a lot of time and energy in Texas politics. And I've put myself out there in different ways. I've made mistakes. I've learned a lot. And that's my background. And as you can tell, I come to this with certain biases. I'm not pretending I'm some sort of objective person who's going to treat all sides equally. I think the current power structure is corrupt in Texas. I feel like people are actively violating human rights and suppressing different communities, whether it's taking away the right to choose whether to have a child or not, whether it's racist criminal justice laws, whether it's allowing big oil companies to pollute our environment. I'm biased in this way, and I think that the status quo is unjust and needs to change. Another thing that I should acknowledge is that I'm working for what I would call progressive outcomes, right? At every level of government. I want to see local people get elected to city council and fight for the people. And when I say progressive, I think, for me, the polls are you with the people or are you with the corporations, is how I would describe it. Are you with the working people who make everything possible in our life, whether it's building this building, keeping the lights on, running the sound for a chat, picking up the garbage, teaching our children, providing healthcare. Are you with the working people or are you with the institutions and interests that are trying to extract the most profit from our lives, who are trying to despoil our natural environment by extracting, materials from the earth and not caring about whether they pollute our water. So long story short, I'm trying to, with my life, advance progressive values and try to achieve progressive outcomes to have a more just and equitable society. So I just want to acknowledge that. So if those ideas are, I guess, not acceptable to you, I just want to give you a heads up at the outset that that's where I'm coming from. Now, in terms of progressive change, I think it's important to start, where we are in Texas. What's the status quo? And I would say that Texas is an amazing, beautiful, diverse state with countless fascinating cultures, amazing human beings. And at the same time, it's a state with a very clear legacy of genocide, of indigenous peoples, of the enslavement of African peoples, of Jim Crow laws that denied basic human and civil rights to people based on the color of their skin. And it's a state where, to this day, the power structure is oppressive, especially towards certain communities. At the same time, there's a lot to celebrate here, right? I wouldn't do this work if I didn't love Texas, if I didn't love so many communities here. And if you've had a chance to travel the state, you know how diverse and interesting Texas is, right? Whether you're talking about the folks in the Rio Grande Valley or El Paso, the Plains area, North Texas, the piney woods in East Texas, the big cities, the small towns. There's so much to love here and to celebrate. And you kind of have to hold both those ideas in your mind if you want to do political work, right? Is who are we fighting for? What do we love and appreciate? What do we want to expand upon? And also what we're trying to change. Another part of the status quo is, well, frankly, the power structure, right? We've got a certain political power structure right now that has one party controlling every level of government. We're talking about the Republican Party controlling the governor's office, the state legislature, both the House and the Senate, with supermajorities to basically, they don't have to consider what the other party says. We control the Republican Party controls the courts, both the Texas Supreme Court, the civil courts, as well as the Court of Criminal Appeals, which decides all criminal cases. They control every government agency, whether you're talking about the Education Agency, the Public Utilities Commission that controls the electric companies, whether you're talking about the Secretary of State, which regulates voting rights. I mean, every aspect of government is controlled by one party. And that's a very oppressive situation. And these folks are acting by and large in the interests of their funders, right? I think a lot of politics is driven by who pays for it. And in this country, we've allowed corporations to make unlimited contributions to politics, to candidates and parties. And that then skews all of the outcomes. Even if people set out to be representatives of the people, when it comes down to it, when campaigns are determined by money and certain very powerful interests decide whether or not you get money, that determines to a large extent political outcomes. We also live in a state where more Texans went to Washington, D.C. on January 6th of 2021 to overthrow the results of the election than any other state. More dollars came from Texas to fund that insurrection, which was basically the closest we've come to a civil war in this country since the 1860s, than any other state. So there's a lot of aspects of Texas that are, I guess you could say, major obstacles to the kind of progressive vision I would like to see. Another big aspect is the way we conduct voting. I mean, in a democracy, like the vote is the primary way to change government, supposedly. But this state has done major things to diminish the right to vote and the power of the vote. So one of the big things you've heard of is gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is something that happens every 10 years. It's more conventionally called redistricting. But basically, after they do the census, they redraw the lines for specific offices. So in Texas, for example, we have 150 state house districts. And What gerrymandering refers to is they draw these lines to maximum the benefits for one party and to the detriment of another. And this applies to the state house, the state senate, and United States congressional districts. And there's different tactics called packing and cracking. Packing is when, basically, in the context of the Republican Party, they smush as many Democrats together in one district to minimize the power of individual Democratic voters. So for example, right now we are in something called the Texas 37th Congressional District, which is the most Democratic district in the country. And they did that to pack all of the Austin Democrats into one seat instead of multiple seats, and to make it so we can only elect one Democratic representative to Congress instead of multiple. On the flip side, they do something called cracking, which is where they will break up important constituencies to minimize their power. For example, in Houston and Dallas, there are extremely important Black communities, historic communities that have developed political organization over many years. And what some of these maps will do will divide one community into 2 or 3 pieces so that they're not able to elect a true representative. On the flip side, away from gerrymandering, also voting laws, they've made it harder to vote, harder to register to vote, harder to cast your ballot by mail, harder to vote on weekends. And these are our tactics that are designed to make it harder for young people in particular to vote and working people. And those are 2 constituencies that, if you go back to my frame between the people and the corporations, those are constituencies that are more likely to vote with the people, statistically speaking. Obviously, at any school, there's conservative students and progressive students. But when you look at overall, young people tend to be more progressive, more willing to fight for social change. And the laws in this state make it harder for young people to vote. Now, these different institutional factors make it extremely hard to accomplish political change. If I could take one example of how the factors play out, I would look at a city called Prairie View, Texas. Has anyone heard of Prairie View? So it's basically 2 hours from here, Waller County, outside of Houston, to our east. And Prairie View is a very interesting place. Well, first of all, it's the site of an historically Black university, Prairie View A&M University. Prairie View A&M was built after the Civil War on the site of a former slave plantation. It's a place that was supposed to be equal to Texas A&M. So there's, the university system for A&M, and Prairie View A&M was supposed to be on par with Texas A&M. Of course, in practice, it hasn't gotten the same resources and support. It's also a place where, when they changed the voting laws in this country, we adopted what's called the 26th Amendment to the US Constitution that became effective in 1971. That lowered the voting age from 21 years of age to 18. And so that's only been around for 50 years or so. And when students at Prairie View A&M, basically 99% Black students, started to vote in Waller County, a county that was basically dominated by white elected officials, the officials there took action to basically say the students weren't residents of the county and did not allow them to vote. This is, just one example of what vote suppression looks like. But going to this theme, I want to share about local organizing. What the students did was they didn't just accept that, okay, I guess we have to vote where our parents live. They organized massive protests, and they filed a lawsuit. And ultimately, they took this lawsuit all the way up to the US Supreme Court. And it was a case called Sim v. United States. And they won that lawsuit. And what they did was they established a constitutional right for college students to vote where you attend at school. So basically, even if you live out of state or in another area, if you go to school here, you can register to vote in Austin and vote here. And that's thanks to the students at Prairie View A&M. So part of why I want to share that story is it illustrates kind of the 2 poles we have here. One, the amazing oppressive environment that would deny people the most fundamental rights, such as who to represent you in government, whether you can vote or not. And at the same time, to me, the inspiration is that these students, 18, 19, 20-year-old students at Prairie View A&M, fought back against this racist local political regime, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and then won a right that applies to every kid in this country who was 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, attending school somewhere. You now have the right to vote in local elections. And so on one side, we're in this oppressive environment. On the other side, there are many examples like this, where people fought locally and then won big gains. Now, getting back to the status quo, I went over the repressive voting laws. I mean, I guess we also just have to talk about the electoral outcomes themselves to illustrate where we are. And for example, in 2020, in the presidential election in November, the Republican nominee, former President Trump, defeated the Democratic nominee, now President Biden, by over 600,000 votes statewide. So that's part of the status quo, right? A 600,000 vote difference. An aspect of that, though, was that over 7 million people who could have voted in that election didn't vote. 6.5 million people who were registered didn't vote at all, like basically 1/3 of the total electorate in the state didn't vote. And then another 1+ million people who were eligible to register to vote didn't even bother to register. So you've got a situation where the people who vote favor one party over the other, but actually the people who don't vote are the ones that have the most power to change politics right now. If you go look at the most recent governor's race, the Democratic nominee, Beto O'Rourke, lost by 894,000 votes. So whereas Biden lost by about 5% and change, Beto lost by 11%. So obviously there's a huge differential between electoral outcomes right now for the two parties. Another very important election was in 2020, the state house races. That is important because the state house drives the redistricting process. And there were several contested seats. Basically, the Republicans maintained control of the state house by about 13,000 votes total. So very small in a state with tens of millions of people. But because they won they maintained the house. That then gave them the right to draw the maps that determine the next 10 years of elections. And so that one very narrow outcome basically led to the consolidation of Republican power for another 10 years, if not more. And so all of this is part of the status quo. And then the last piece I would share for people who are involved in politics or even care about politics is that there's disillusionment and disappointment among a lot of people who were hoping for change in those elections. 2020, 2022, a lot of people said this is the year, the Democrats are going to do it. And now because of those losses, there is an amazing sense of disillusionment, disappointment, futility, hopelessness. And these are part of the status quo as well, because going back to that 7 million plus people who didn't vote in the 2020 presidential election, which some people thought was the most important election of our lives, those people could have made the difference, but they didn't. And if we don't get those people out to vote, nothing's going to change. So this is a pretty sad state of affairs from a certain point of view. And I guess from there, where I'd like to go is to try to imagine what would happen if things were different. Like what would change if the political outcomes were different, right? And the way I like to think about it is, how would our people benefit? If you're a person who's struggling to buy a home, would the outcomes be different? If you're a person who was denied the right to vote, would the outcomes be different? And I think that if there was a progressive movement motivated by young people in particular that changed the politics of the state, we would have different outcomes. For example, healthcare. The current leadership has said we're not going to accept federal support to expand who gets healthcare. It's called Medicaid expansion. With one change of who is in charge of the legislature, you could expand Medicaid and give healthcare to millions more people. If you had a different leadership in charge of public education, you could pay teachers more. You could have smaller class sizes in elementary schools. You could make sure that special education and special needs funding is fully taken care of. What would that mean, for so many people in this state? For the environment, right? Right now, major polluting companies have to get what's called an air quality permit or a water quality permit. But the current leadership allows those permits to go out to industry with almost no scrutiny. And so you have places where the water is poisoned, where the air is poisoned. so that with a different leadership, you could have a cleaner environment, more sustainable environment. You could take action to address climate change. And so these are the kinds of things I like to keep in mind when I'm working in politics, because it can be so disillusioning to confront the current power structure, the idea that the governor, the attorney general, every head of a state department is controlled by one party, and they're loyal to a small set of economic interests. You know, what gives us hope? Well, one of the things that gives us hope is trying to imagine what a better future could be if we had a government that was more representative of the people and more willing to fight for progressive values. Oops, busy. Now, this is not to say that, you know, if Democrats win, everything will be perfect. And I want to be very clear that, you know, in this political system we have, there's corruption on all sides, and there's weak leaders on all sides. And just because one party wins, that doesn't mean that, you know, massive changes are going to happen. But any one of these reforms that I mentioned, for example, just expanding Medicaid to give another million people insurance, would save lives. I mean, Texas has more women who die in childbirth, you know, maternal mortality, than almost any other state in the country. We have more poverty. We have, you know, homelessness. We have all these issues that are more pervasive in this state as compared to numerous other states. Basically, there's like Alabama, Mississippi, there's a few other states that have poverty rates similar to ours, but overall, we live in a state that has defunded many aspects of the social safety net. You know, whether you're talking about public school funding, which used to be much higher in Texas and is now very low, whether you're talking about public health funding, whether you're talking about the environment, whether you're talking about programs to help impoverished people, Texas is near the bottom. And each of those programs ultimately results in life or death to individual people, right? So to me, these are the kinds of things that motivate us, but there are some very specific things that even if you're motivated to work for political change, that are standing in the way. And I kind of described the status quo, but I want to get a little bit more specific, and in particular to talk about how well organized the ruling party is. You know, the Republican Party in Texas. They have organized a number of amazingly powerful constituencies, starting with corporations, right? The governor of our state is able to accept unlimited campaign contributions. So for example, in his last campaign, there's a man named Kelsey Warren who owns a company that builds oil pipelines. And in the last legislative session of the Texas legislature, there was a lot of concern from corporations that because of that freeze in February 2021, when people died, when the state was ground to a halt, that we would accomplish changes to our energy policy, that we would regulate for example, natural gas energy generators who went offline during the freeze, that we would encourage more diverse energy sources, including renewable energy. And what Governor Abbott and others in the Republican Party did was make sure that there weren't major reforms like that happened. They basically protected the oil and gas industry. And as a result, Kelsey Warren gave Governor Abbott a $1 million campaign contribution. Like one person was able to give $1 million to a political candidate. And he wasn't the only one. And what the Republican Party overall has done has let corporations know that they're going to fight for them. They're going to make sure that we don't increase the minimum wage in Texas from $7.25 an hour. They're going to make sure that we don't allow workers to be guaranteed paid sick leave. And they do that by telling cities like Austin, you cannot raise the minimum. Like Austin, even if our city council wanted to raise the minimum wage in Austin, they're prevented by state law from doing so. And there are laws of all sorts that make it harder to, for example, organize a union. In many other states in the United States, for example, public workers, teachers, or city employees are allowed to form unions and then bargain for higher wages, benefits, working conditions. In Texas, it's illegal to have a union of public employees, right? And if you think about how many workers in the state work for city government, county government, state government, the water department, whatever, you're basically saying that these millions of public employees cannot have effective bargaining power, right? And the corporations are part of that key constituency. Another key part of the constituency of the Republican Party are churches, and in particular, conservative religious communities that, for example, support a ban on abortion, or who support other Republican policies. And this is a major source of support, and it goes below the radar in some ways because churches are considered charitable organizations, and so they're allowed to raise unlimited money for their own activities. But we know in Texas that a lot of churches on Sunday will say, go to the polls and vote this way. And that's a very effective way to convince people who don't otherwise follow politics to get them to vote for the party of your choice. So that's another key aspect of the Republican coalition. There are also additional groups that are, some people call dark money groups. I don't know if you've heard that terminology, but basically dark money refers to part of our tax law where people can anonymously donate to political organizations. One of these groups is called the Texas Public Policy Foundation. They have a very nice office on Congress Avenue, a couple blocks from the Capitol. And so they can accept millions of dollars anonymously that no one can see who their donors are. And then they spend a lot of money to advance Republican priorities. For example, they draft policy. So like these state representatives at the Capitol, they don't actually write the policies. This group, TPPF, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, using unlimited corporate money largely, hires the really smart people to draft the policy. And then all the representative has to do is, okay, who wants to co-sponsor? They also file lawsuits. For example, if Austin did this, we passed a paid sick leave ordinance that would have told employers like McDonald's and every private employer in Austin, you must provide paid sick leave benefits. Well, the Texas Public Policy Foundation sued the city and took that case all the way up to the Texas Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court overruled Austin's policy. And so these dark money organizations are also part of the coalition. Another part of the coalition is the media. And this is more subtle, but if you think about who owns the major TV stations and media organizations, it's the same rich people, the corporate interests that are funding the Republican Party overall. And even though they present issues in a more objective way oftentimes, they'll skew things. And one example is how a couple of years ago, every TV station was running stories about how Democrats want to defund the police, right? You've probably seen some of these stories. In reality, very few, if any, Democrats running for office said, if you elect me for Congress, I'm going to defund the police. Almost no candidate was saying that. There was a whole movement, the movement for Black Lives, the folks fighting for justice for George Floyd, who was killed by police in Minneapolis. There was a whole movement pushing back against police brutality. But it wasn't like the Democratic Party was making that part of their platform. But the media presented it as such, and that informed public opinion, and I think helped determine the outcome of some of these elections. And so all of these interests together in Texas have been combined in a successful campaign since at least the mid-1990s. 1994 was the last time a Democrat was elected statewide in Texas. So you're talking about 29 years of entrenched power. And that becomes compounded over time because basically each legislative session, every 2 years, they can pass more laws. For example, to make it harder to vote. They also impact people's hopes and dreams for what's possible in Texas. If they've been in power for this long, some people think it's inevitable. So if you're a young person going to school and you're thinking about, well, am I going to get involved in politics and social change? You might just think it's a waste of time. That maybe you're just going to focus on taking care of yourself and your family and your friends and making the best of it because change is impossible. And so all of this leads to a sense of inevitability that in Texas, the Republicans are in charge. Now that's not the only problem. The flip side of it is the Texas Democratic Party is an extremely weak political organization and political movement, right? So on one side, you have this extremely well-organized group, but on the other side, You have a Democratic Party, which it's important to say, under our laws, our tax laws, our election laws, the party has an extremely important position. It's the group that can accept money to run campaigns. It's the group that decides, to a large extent, how elections are conducted, how primaries are run. So the party matters a lot in the United States political system. But in Texas, we have a party that has a very weak brand, you could say, especially when you get out of the big cities. You tell people you're a Democrat, it does not carry much weight. It's not considered to be valuable or important. And at the same time that the Republican coalition with corporations, right-wing religious organizations and others is strong, the organizations that make up a part of the Democratic coalition, so to speak, are not as strong as they need to be. One example is unions. In Texas, we have something called union density, which is 50% or lower than a lot of other states. That means there are far fewer union members. There's less city workers in unions, there's less teachers in unions. And unions are important because they're a place where workers can consolidate their resources and make collective investments, right? If you're a member of the teachers union in a place like California, you might pay $100 out of every paycheck for union dues. And then that union can fight for you in the workplace, make sure your principal doesn't discipline you, but they can also take some of those dollars and spend them on campaigns. And so unions are a way to gather small dollar contributions from countless workers and put them towards political causes. But in this state, we have far fewer union members than many other states. There's other organizations out there. In Austin, we've got a lot of great ones. There's groups called Workers' Defense Project, Austin Justice Coalition, the Sunrise Movement. These are so-called progressive nonprofit organizations. But there's not enough of them to counterbalance the other side. And in particular, once you get out of basically the four biggest cities in Texas, Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, and Austin, you don't have many of these organizations at all. And that's extremely important because in Texas, we have 40 cities that have at least 100,000 people, right? Like the 40th largest city in Texas, which might be Wichita Falls, is bigger than the second largest city in other states, right? But all of our progressive infrastructure is in the top 4, and then cities 5 through 40 have very little to none. And so that means there's a lot of organizing that isn't happening. There's a lot of students who aren't being spoken to. There's workers who aren't being spoken to around the state. And these factors then lead to other negative things. For one of them, if you're a Democratic office holder in Texas right now, your loyalty to the Democratic Party is not as strong as on the Republican side, because the party can't help you as much. And so you have a lot of office holders who don't have that loyalty, and they might actually try to collaborate with Republican office holders because those are the ones who have power, instead of building a separate base of power. You have famous Democratic elected officials who, instead of sharing their campaign contributions with the rest of the party, keep it for themselves. There's one state senator in Houston who has so much money in his campaign account, over $11 million, that a lot of his money is in investment funds. He is basically hoarding this money for himself instead of spending it to help others. And going back to 2020, when Democrats lost the state house by about 14,000 votes, imagine a couple of these guys who are sitting on 10 million. If they had put that money into the overall effort, they could have theoretically flipped a couple of these seats and changed the next 10 years of politics. But because they didn't feel that loyalty, the reason they don't feel that loyalty is because the party can't help them, because the party hasn't been in power for 29 years or whatever. And so all of these things, they get compounded. And I guess, if I'm not depressing you so far, maybe you're excited about the status quo, but this is really the state of affairs we're in. I'll give you one example. In this last election, 2022, some people think that the Democratic Party is who gets out the vote, right? And we have something called the Texas Democratic Party. The Texas Democratic Party didn't hire a single person to knock doors in 2022. That organization did not have any money to hire field staff. And field staff, the people that knock doors and speak to voters are the ones that actually get out the vote. So that means that the state party didn't have any ability to counteract what the Republican Party was doing. It was entirely dependent on one candidate, Beto O'Rourke, he was the one who raised all the money. And that meant that if you were a Democrat, all of your hopes and dreams were in the hands of one person who was not popular enough to carry everybody. And it's basically a continuing dynamic where, because the Democratic Party has a weak reputation, that money goes to candidates instead of the party. And then the investments are not being made across the state, and just continues one cycle after the other, leading us to cynicism, hopelessness, some people saying they want to leave the state, and what have you. And so that's kind of my sum up of where we are right now. And I think I have to acknowledge that for a lot of us, that's such a heavy thing to come to terms with, about how entrenched the power structure is, that we say to ourselves, well, screw it. There's nothing that can be done, right? But I guess for me, maybe I'm crazy, but I think that something can be done. And I guess I want to say that people who stay in politics, it's almost like a religion. It's like a faith of sorts, that through continued action, we can make a difference. There's one quote that I like from Che Guevara, who was a Cuban revolutionary. And he says that the true revolutionary is guided by feelings of love, which speaks to what actually motivates people who do this work and stay in this work. It's not love necessarily for the country or the state, but it's love for people, right? And wanting to fight. Bernie Sanders, in his most recent presidential campaign, said, "Are you willing to fight for someone you don't know?" Right? And that's something that motivates me, that I might be okay, right? I have a law degree. I've been a city attorney. My family's doing all right. We've got a home in Austin. But that's not enough, right? That we need to fight for others so that we can have a more just and equitable society. Another quote I would share is from Margaret Mead. You might have heard this one, that never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Like the idea that a small group of us, if we really got our stuff together, that we could make big change. So, once we decide that we want to stay in this fight, then the question becomes how, right? And one way to frame this is what's our strategy and what are our tactics? If our goal is statewide progressive political change, how do we get there? And for me, I just have to say the strategy is not vote blue or any blue will do, or it's not shaming people, go vote, this is the most important election of our lives. It's not buying TV ads to, demonize the opposition. It's not sending mail pieces, like all these things that we associate with political campaigns. This is not how you change human behavior. We're talking about 7 million plus people who didn't vote in the so-called most important election of our lives. Sending them a piece of mail or playing them an internet ad is not going to convince them to change their behavior. There's not going to be some app. Like you're not going to tell people, okay, take out your phones, download this app, get all your friends to vote. That's not going to do it either. What does make change? It's talking to people. But before we get to the tactics, I just want to say that the strategy has to be to build a coalition that basically unites several key constituencies. It's the Black community in Texas. It's big segments of the Hispanic community. It's other people of color. It's white progressives. It's union members. It's environmentalists. There's kind of a constellation of groups that are each distinct and have different objectives. But together, if they combine, they could change the politics in the state. And I think this is the coalition that elected Barack Obama when he became president, and this is the coalition that Texas would need to build over time. These are the people that have the most to gain, right? If you're an environmentalist, water policy, air policy, climate action. These are the most important issues. You know, if you're the Black community and you're looking at a history of racist laws that took wealth out of the community, that forced so many people into the criminal justice system, that to this day denies people employment rights, you know, you have a ton to gain by a change in who the Attorney General is, who the legislature is. You know, you go on down the line, the immigrant community, you know, unions, each group has a lot to gain from political change. And so that's the coalition we need to build together so that everyone's interests are aligned here. And we need to, you know, tailor messages. You can't have a one-size-fits-all message for our coalition. You need to have a diversity of messages that relate to each of our coalition partners. But these messages, they do need to be effective. When I ran for Congress in 2020, the Democratic Party's closing message was about protections for pre-existing conditions. I don't know if anyone remembers that, but it was this whole conversation about Obamacare, and there was a portion of Obamacare that said if you had a pre-existing condition, you couldn't be denied health care. And it was, first of all, it was a mouthful of a message. You know, protections for pre-existing conditions, you won't be denied buying an insurance plan. Like, it already kind of narrows the scope of what we're talking about. Some people don't have health care at all, and they don't qualify for government health care, so it doesn't relate to them. And some people have enough money that they pay for their health care and they're not worried about it. So the message was only tailored to a subset of people. Meanwhile, President Trump, one of his most effective messages in the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas was, I sent you a check. I sent you a $1,200 check with my name on it. It was like a stimulus check. What a simple message is that? I sent y'all money so you could spend it. And so, you know, we need to build this coalition, but we also need to have clear messages that speak to what we're trying to accomplish. But I want to get back to the tactics now. You know, ultimately, it's about talking to human beings. So what is the most effective form of communication? It is a direct, one-to-one human interaction. Most of politics is spending money on other things. A TV ad, it's an indirect message. A mail piece is an indirect message. Even getting text messages or a phone call, it's not as personal as standing in someone's space to asking them a question. Hey, what do you think about this? Now, I'm not talking about a lot of political campaigning at the door, which is more transactional. I don't know if any of you have received one of these messages where someone knocks on your door. Hey, I'm Mike, I'm a volunteer with the Democrats. We count on you to vote for so-and-so. He's a good Democrat. Like, that's what a lot of political messaging is. But really what we need to be doing is asking people how you're doing, what matters to you, and having conversations. Because what we're trying to do is not convince voters to switch their allegiance. That could be some of what campaign is about. But in the context of Texas, it has to be about convincing people to vote at all, right? 7 million people who didn't vote. How do you convince them to change their behavior and believe a different outcome is possible? And that's where these one-to-one conversations matter. That's where repeated interactions matter. It can't just be October and the election is November. I've never seen you before. Go vote for my candidate. What about the rest of the year? What about when it's not an election year? Who's talking to these folks? And there are studies that prove these things, that the most effective form of communication is direct one-to-one contact. And there's a different way of measuring it, and it's called social pressure. Now, there are groups that study the effectiveness of electoral tactics. The most effective tactic, and sometimes the only tactic that works, is something that's called social pressure. There was a study that a group did. 16 million handwritten postcards were sent by a progressive group during the election cycle in 2020. These postcards were handwritten by volunteers around the country, and they were personalized. Dear so-and-so, I'm so-and-so, this election really matters. We need you to get out and vote. The study showed that those messages produce zero impact on voting behavior. By contrast, if you tell someone who you vote for is confidential, but whether you vote is public, that actually has an impact. I don't know if you've gotten one of these mail pieces. They're actually pretty offensive. They're like, six of your 8 neighbors have already voted, but you haven't. Mike, make sure you vote. That message, even if it's in a postcard or a mail piece, is actually effective because you feel accountable. And in the context of a direct, personal, one-on-one conversation, that's where social pressure is at its peak. One way to think about this is if you go up to someone you don't know, introduce yourself, and ask them a question. That person, human nature, is going to want to either agree with you or help you in some way. If you say, do you care about the environment? Would you be willing to sign this petition to protect the watershed in Austin? If you're standing in front of someone asking that question, their human nature is going to be to help you, to want to fill in the gaps, to not disappoint you. Whereas if you leave that question on their doorstep, stick the petition to their door, it's much easier to ignore. And the reason I'm talking about one-to-one conversations and social pressure is that, well, first of all, 98% of the money in politics doesn't go to these things. And also, these are the only things that are going to help us build a long-term, lasting coalition for political change. And then this gets to why I think local organizing should be the focus. So one way to ask this question is, if you had $100 million to spend on politics, how would you spend it? Would you give $80 million to Beto's campaign? And if you give it all to Beto and he loses, what happens to that money? Versus if you gave that money to 100 organizations in 100 different cities, how would that money be spent? Because if you give it to local groups, they're going to actually be from the community and responsive to the community and more able to communicate effective messages. They're also going to be there when the campaigns are over. And so that's part of the theory we're talking about. So I think we should be moving to investing in year-round organizing. We should be talking about issues that matter to people. And we should be focused on local organizations communicating on messages that would actually impact people's lives. Let's make politics real and concrete. So this is kind of the thesis. Now, let me talk a little bit more about why one-to-one conversations are going to matter. One of the problems we have in politics right now is misinformation and lack of education. And some of this is intentional. The schools have been defunded for decades. There are media organizations that promote basically blatantly false information. And how do you address that? Well, we know that, for example, people on social media stay in their own bubbles. But whereas if you get someone at the door, and you can actually have a conversation to hear them out, let them say their ideas out loud and respond with factual information. That's an opportunity that otherwise wouldn't exist to kind of confront the lack of education and the prevalence of misinformation in the community. It's also a way to concretely identify supporters of a campaign and create accountability. One of the things that campaigns do is not only ask you, will you support so-and-so or vote for so-and-so, but will you make a plan to vote? How do you plan to vote? Oh, are you going to vote early? Are you going to vote on election day? Are you going to vote by mail? And having people say this plan to another human being creates accountability. And if we can kind of build this accountability to each other, that's going to make our political work more effective. All right, so just try to sum this up a little bit. What I'm trying to argue for is that we want to build, that the strategy for changing Texas politics is to build a broad, multiracial, progressive coalition composed of a number of different interest groups, including unions, environmentalists, white progressives, Black, progressive Latinos, and others. And that we want to invest in year-round organizing on issues that matter to people, and that we want to invest as much money as possible in human person-to-person interactions. And that theoretically, through these tactics, we could make up the difference of the number of votes that were cast in the 2020 election, basically make up that difference of 650,000 votes that the Democratic nominee lost by, and add over the next several years 800,000 or 1 million more Democratic voters. That this would allow not only just for Texas to deliver its electoral college votes for the presidential nominee, but could flip who's in charge of the state legislature and start to change the laws in a more progressive direction. Now, accepting that as kind of a theory of change, when could this happen? It's no time soon, frankly. If someone tells you that we're going to flip Texas in 2024, I guess that's a wonderful idea, and miracles do happen, but it's really not likely. There's a few factors why that's not true. Some of it is out of the control of Texans. For example, there's going to be a presidential campaign, and the Democratic nominee for president is not going to spend money in the state of Texas because they think it's futile, right? And because money tends to follow candidates and not parties, a lot of the money in politics in 2024 is going to go to that presidential nominee, and that money is not going to be spent here. So that's a huge loss for everyone who's trying to change the state. Another challenge is that a Democrat's going to run for Senate against Ted Cruz, and that it's still there. The Senate campaign is also going to be a really difficult challenge. One, because the presidential campaign, there are people who are popular Democrats who are being encouraged to run for Senate right now next year. But what they're going to look at is, well, the Democratic presidential candidate is not going to spend money here. And whether it's Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, or someone else, the Republican nominee is going to be really popular with Republicans. So it's futile to try to run for Senate and to spend 1.5 years of my life and try to raise $50 million because I don't have a chance. So now that just compounds the problem further. You don't have the president spending money here, and you might not have a good Democratic nominee for Senate. And then the state house. We talked earlier how redistricting happened. The lines were redrawn. A lot of the seats were made safe for Republicans. And that's going to discourage Democrats from challenging them. So in each of these districts, you won't have the same quality of candidates, and you won't have people spending as much money. And I've talked about gerrymandering. Long story short, because a lot of these negative factors are self-perpetuating, there's not an ability to turn them around in time for next year. That really, if you believe in long-term political change, what we need to be talking about is a strategy that looks at 8 years from now, even 12 years from now. And that could be extremely depressing, right? If you're the parent of a transgender child, like I am, and you're looking at a state legislature that wants to criminalize parenting that's affirming of the gender identity of your child, can you wait 10 years for political change, right? It's hard to think about it that way, but there are models where it actually happened. And the three I would point to are California, Arizona, and Georgia. These are places that were extremely Republican, and then through long-term organizing campaigns, their politics changed. It might be weird to think of California as a Republican state, but Ronald Reagan was the governor from California before he was president. In the 1990s, the governor of California was a man named Pete Wilson, who among the laws he passed an anti-immigrant law that was called Proposition 187, and took away a lot of rights for the immigrant community. Now, what that led to, that attack on the immigrant community and on the Latino California population overall, led to folks committing to organize and changing the politics. And ultimately, the attack on Latino immigrants convinced the Latino community to vote in higher numbers and change the politics of California. There was a similar event in Arizona where they passed a law called SB 1070. There was a similar bill that basically encouraged the criminalization of the immigrant community and basically expanded law enforcement operations against folks crossing the border. And that also led to community groups folks led by indigenous and Mexican-American communities in particular, that they formed new organizations and over a 15-year period organized until most recently, Arizona went for the Democratic nominee for president. Georgia, some of you may have heard the story of Stacey Abrams, who was a state legislator in Georgia. Her path in Georgia politics, in terms of changing the politics of the state, really started when Barack Obama passed the Affordable Care Act. And she started organizing in Georgia to get people to sign on for the Affordable Care Act to get their Obamacare. And then she ran into obstacles where she realized that the state wasn't going to accept or make it easy for folks to get access to that healthcare. And so she started encouraging people to register to vote so they could elect people that would support healthcare access. And then as she started registering people to vote, she started coming back to people, hey, did you get registered? They say, well, I filed an application, but the county elections clerk rejected it. So then she went from voter registration to legal action. She built a whole legal team that started suing the Georgia officials. Anyway, long story short, this little program to get people to sign on to Obamacare led to statewide organizing, an organization called Fair Fight that flipped Georgia 10 years later and sent 2 Democrats to the US Senate from the state of Georgia. So there are these models, but the common thread there is that you're talking about a 10 or 15-year process for political change, a 10 or 15-year window of concerted political action. And if I was to look at Texas, when did that window start for us? You know, what was the year one of the 10 or the 15-year cycle? And I think that you have to say that's 2017. That was after President Trump got elected and Democrats in Texas got mobilized like they never had before. And so even if we're on closer to the 10-year cycle than the 15-year cycle, that would put a reasonable goal of changing Texas politics by 2028. And so, you know, can we stay in it that long? Now, if we do invest in local organizations, which to me is the key, then what we're doing is we're investing in multiple outcomes. For one, for example, one thing my organization has done is, Ground Game Texas, is we started local campaigns to get an initiative on the city ballot. So for example, last year, well, 2021, in May, no, it was last year, 2022, sorry. In May of 2022 in Austin, we had a vote on something we called the Austin Freedom Act. And it was a measure that would decriminalize marijuana in the city of Austin and stop police from using no-knock warrants. And this was a tactic to get people to care about a local election and to especially get young people out to vote who might not care about some of the other issues on the ballot, but you can get their attention by saying, hey, you want to decriminalize weed? Go vote. We won the Austin campaign, 85% voted yes. And more young people voted in Austin in May of last year than any other city in Texas. Basically 8 times the number of young people voted in Austin than Houston, which is a much larger city. So we took that idea and we said, okay, now let's go to additional cities. We went to San Marcos among 4 other cities in November of last year. And San Marcos, where there's Texas State University, again, we did a marijuana decriminalization campaign. The kids there called it the referendum, right, to decriminalize weed. And through that campaign, over 500 students registered to vote in the city of San Marcos. The measure passed with 82% support. And because so many students voted, it actually changed who the county leaders were. There was a Republican district attorney. The Democrat beat the Republican by about 700 votes. And our ballot measure added basically 900 votes of new voters who voted yes on the marijuana measure. So basically by getting students to vote in favor of marijuana reform, then changed who won other statewide or local offices. And we were able to measure this, that we basically added 4.8% more voters. And the way we measured that was we took the thousands of people who signed the petition to get the weed thing on the ballot. And those people who signed the petition, basically 60% of them voted, whereas 42% of people overall voted. So we can show that okay, the petition signers were more likely to vote. And that added, about 5%. And so one theory of how to get that 800,000 votes we need to change politics in 2028 is what if part of the way was that you get maybe 15 cities to have popular issues on the ballot, and that adds 5% in each city, and suddenly you're adding maybe a couple 100,000 votes, especially if you're doing it in big cities. And so that's one theory for how political change could happen, that basically instead of focusing on the top of the ticket, who's running for president, who's running for governor, you instead focus on what's on the bottom of the ticket. And you get people to vote for something that will actually impact them in their communities, and then along the way, vote for the candidates. So instead of leading with the party or with the named candidate, you lead with the issue. We find that issues are actually more popular than candidates. Marijuana reform, I think close to 90% of Texans want marijuana reform, but it hasn't happened. So that's an opportunity to show the office holders don't represent the people. And so if you can start with that at the local level, that could be one way to build change. One example I have of this working is actually a congressman from this area, Greg Casar, who you may have heard of. Greg Casar started organizing with a group called Workers' Defense Project, basically organizing for better working conditions for immigrant laborers. Then he got elected to the city council. Then he got elected to Congress. But he started out with that very local base, organizing workers, and then built a whole political career on that. So these are the kinds of things that we want to, suggest as a strategy, that there's not, I'm not here to say that local organizing is going to do everything. You still need all the different pieces. You do need a Democratic Party. You do need good candidates at every level. But you don't need to hope for national groups or celebrities to save us. That, for example, if everyone that was here got together and started a committee to put something on the ballot or start an organizing campaign, that y'all could do a lot more together than if, say, instead you just sent your money to some national candidate or posted things on social media. That if you actually spoke to your neighbors, if you spoke to people in your communities, that would be a way to effectively start political change. All right, so I think I've been meandering a little bit, but I guess one of the other things I want to say about local organizing is that part of what we need to do to motivate those additional million voters is we need to find good organizers to do it. We focus on the candidate at the top of the ticket, but there are people around the state, your age, 20-something, 30-something years old, that are really dynamic organizers. And some of them are organizing for climate action. Some of them are organizing for workers' rights. Unfortunately, a lot of them are going to burn out and quit politics if we don't take care of them. And so by investing in local organizers, you're kind of investing in the infrastructure we need for long-term change. I've had the privilege of meeting folks in places like Hidalgo County near the border in Rio Grande Valley who work for an organization called Lupe. It's like a farm worker and immigrant rights group. And there are like at least a half dozen, 20 and 30 somethings that I can just picture in my eye who are tremendously gifted organizers. They're good communicators. They're bright, attractive people. They inspire their peers. There's folks in El Paso who are organizing on climate issues. There's folks in Austin organizing for criminal justice reform. We need to keep these people in the fight because each of these people is like gold in terms of political change. But if we only pay them $40,000 a year for a couple of years and they don't win enough, they're going to move on to other things, and that's going to be a rational choice, right? Ultimately, you can't bang your head against the wall your whole life trying to make something happen that's impossible. And so if we can invest in these groups and not just ensure that there's resources, but also create paths to victory, I think that's a big part of political change, that we learn how to win. And that's one of the things I like about these issue campaigns is that, in Austin, we decriminalized marijuana. We got that win. Even if the state won't follow in the footsteps of New Mexico, Louisiana, Colorado, Oklahoma, all the states around us that have legalized marijuana. At least we decided locally, okay, no one's going to get arrested for a small amount. Another city in the Rio Grande Valley, we did a $15 an hour minimum wage. We couldn't do it for the private employers, but we did it for the city workers. And that was the first time that it happened in that region where there was a $15 an hour minimum wage, setting a standard for others. And so by winning, I think we also create equity. Because to me, winning begets more winning. In the same way that all the compounded losses of the last 29 years have demoralized Democrats in Texas, if we can win locally, that can then create momentum for statewide change. All right, so that's kind of where I'll stop, that it is possible, that it's not easy, that there is a way forward that focuses on local organizing, that we can't wait for heroes, white knights, celebrities to save us. We can't wait for even major political institutions to save us. I don't even think we can wait for the Texas Democratic Party to save us. But if we want this change, this progressive change, there is a path forward that involves organizing locally, speaking to human beings, hopefully collectively having millions of conversations, and inspiring people to actually care about politics and make a difference in their lives. So that's my chat. Appreciate y'all coming out, and I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has anything to say. Thank you.